Okay. I think most of you are regulars to these webinars, so you know who I am. My name is David Fass, and I'm the trainer at iNetSoft, and this is the latest in this sequence of webinars, short little tidbits, just giving you information about basic operations of style intelligence. Okay, and today's little show is going to be on the topic of, see if I could find it here, chart comparisons. So the idea of chart comparisons, at least this term, is something of a tautology, because if you're not doing a comparison on a chart, then what are you doing, right? I mean, charts are designed to do comparisons, so almost any chart that you make, you'll be doing some kind of comparisons. So really the nature of this discussion is to kind of introduce you to the different types of comparisons that you can do on a chart, and hopefully give you some ideas of different directions that you can go and how you can address different needs that you have. So let's get on with it. So somewhere in the background here I have my browser up and I have my portal up and running. I see somebody has their hand up. Lida, looks like you have the hand up, but I don't know if you're trying to get my attention or not. So I'm gonna lower the hand so it doesn't keep popping up. So if you did have a question, again, please type in the chat box. So anyway, I have my portal up and running here. I'm going to open the Visual Composer, and we're going to talk about doing different kinds of comparisons on charts. So like I said, the essence of a chart is to do comparisons. So if I create a new dashboard, a new view sheet here, let me just expand this to full size. So I'll just select as a data source one of our sample worksheets. And I can go ahead and add a simple chart here. And the most basic chart that you could imagine is something like this, where you've got, let's say, a dimension like category on the x-axis, and you've got some measure like total on the y-axis. All right, very basic. And of course, even in making so simple a chart, you are doing a comparison. You're comparing the different categories. That's the point of making this chart, is to compare the different categories. If you didn't want to do that, why would you make the chart? And of course you can limit the number of categories that you want to compare. In this case, you could do that easily by adding a selection list for category, just like this. Right? In the event that you didn't want to compare all 7 categories, you could just limit it to, let's say, games and hardware. Maybe add a few others. All right, so there you can go ahead and kind of constrain the comparison that you're doing on the chart. And as the designer of the dashboard, of course, you can decide whether to expose the selection element or not, right? So you can leave this selection element here, so it will be available for the user to choose which groups they want to compare, right? This is how the user would see it. Or as the designer, of course, you can choose to hide that, right? You can go into properties and you can set the visibility property to hide, right? And then what the user would see would be this dashboard, right? So, you know, it's just showing the 3 categories that you, the designer, have selected, but the user doesn't have the opportunity to change that. Right? So that's the most basic kinds of comparisons that you can do. Now, of course, you can go far beyond that, so I'll remove this selection list. And let's take a look at some other kinds of comparisons that you can do, mainly by breaking up the data in different ways, right? Comparing different subgroups of data. So I'm going to reopen the chart editor and make this a little bit bigger so everybody can see, hopefully. Right, and so one of the basic things that you would do is you would break out subgroups using some visual identifier, such as color or shape or size. Right? So a typical thing you might do for a bar chart would be to color code some subgroup within the data. Let's say region. Right? So the region is either, I think, east or west. Right? And if I want to break out the different regions using color, I would use the visual panel at the bottom. So I would drag the region field down to the color region, and that breaks out the 2 regions using color. Right? I think I previously set these colors to something other than their defaults. That these are not the default colors, but we'll just go with that. If you do need to change the color, just as an aside, you can click the Edit Color button here, and switch up the colors in the palette. I think the defaults are kind of a lighter blue and a lighter green, but this is fine. Okay, now, you can see that when you do that, basically you end up with a stacked bar chart. That's kind of the default when you break out these subgroups like this, in this case region. They're stacked, but that's something that you can control, right? You can go to the Select Chart Style button over here, right, and then choose Bar Type Chart. Right? What had been selected before was the automatic chart generator, I suppose you could call it, and that basically just tries to make its best guess at what the best chart design would be for the selections that you've made. But if you explicitly want an unstacked bar chart, you could just select the bar chart option, leave the stack option here disabled, and press apply, and that will get you an unstacked bar chart. Right? So in this kind of case where you're breaking apart the groups based on some categorical field, you can choose whether you want it stacked or not. Okay. Now you can go further than that. Of course, you do have these other fields in the visual panel. You can break up the data by shape, by size, by labeling groups with text, and so you can play around with all of those to get different effects. Of course, instead of identifying the subgroups by color, we could have identified the regions by shape, which would have looked something like that, or by size, right? And of course, we could add additional dimensions in here. We could, in addition to breaking it out by region, if we wanted to, we could break it out by product name using color. So all those things are on the table. But one interesting thing that I wanted to bring your attention to is the case where you may want to break up the data to do comparisons, but not have those groups identified visibly using color or shape or size. For example, let's say that I wanted to be able to look at the individual years, right? I wanted to break it up by year, but I didn't want to use color or shape or size to do that. What you can do is you can use this break by field. Right, so I can grab the date field here, drag it down to break by, and then basically what it will do, I see there's a question, I'll get to it in a second, and basically what it will do is it'll keep the color that it had originally, right? It's breaking up the two regions using color, but it will additionally break up the data into subgroups based on year. Right, and the tooltip gives me the information, right? So here I'm looking at the region USA West 2015, here's 2014, 2013, 2012. Right? So it's broken up the data. It allows me to do comparisons based on year without adding any additional visual formatting other than just the lines to distinguish the groups. Okay, so that's just a couple of things that you can do to compare different groups in the data. Note that in all these cases, I'm working with just one measure, right? In all these cases, I'm just looking at the total, right? I'm just breaking up the totals in a different way. I'm breaking it up by category, breaking it up by region, breaking it up by year, and these are all giving me different ways to compare subgroups within the data, but always according to the total. That's the only measure that I'm looking at right now. Now, before we get on to looking at additional measures, it's important to note that you can do different things with different chart types, right? So here we've been working with a bar chart metaphor, but of course there are other chart types, and with other chart types you can do some other interesting things. For example, if we switch this to a point type chart, just switch it to a regular point type chart, then what we might consider doing is we might consider using the shape of the point to represent the date. Right, so currently what we're looking at here is we're still using the break by field to represent the dates, which means that each of these points represents a different year. But it's not entirely clear. I think you'd have to point at each point to find out what year it is, and so on. What you might choose to do in this case is, instead of using the break by option, you could drag the date field down to the shape option. Right? And then what it will do is it will use different point types to represent the different years. So now you can look at a legend over here, and it tells you which point is related to which year. Right? So this allows us to do an easy comparison year to year, region to region, and category to category. Right? So these are just some of the interesting things you can do. purely by playing around with the dimensions, breaking up the dimensions, breaking up the data into different dimensions in different ways. Okay, always with a single measure. Right, so that's that kind of covers a few things you could do just with a single measure. Let's move on to something a little bit more interesting, where we'll play around with multiple measures. Right, and obviously ultimately the goal is to build a chart that possibly has multiple dimensions and multiple measures, and to try to construct that chart in interesting ways to bring out the effect that you're looking for, bring out the comparisons that you're looking for. So I'm going to remove this chart, and I'll just start over again, kind of simply with a basic chart. Another basic chart, and we'll just start with a simple case of two measures. So again, the category on the x-axis, there's the dimension, and I can just drop on two measures such as quantity purchased and total. Okay, so now I've got two different measures on the y-axis and a single dimension on the x-axis. Now the default here, you'll notice, is that when you have multiple measures, and this is true for two measures and for any additional measures that you put on the y-axis, it'll give you a separate axis for each of those. So if I went ahead and I added a third measure, then I would get a third y-axis region. Right? So in a sense, these kind of all look like independent charts. They just happen to be combined into a single, block. But each of these is kind of a standalone chart. All right, so what if you don't want that? What if you want to have, I'm putting it back to the original two measures, the quantity and the total. What if you wanted to have these two measures on the same axis? Right, so what you would do is you would press this middle button here, which is the switch to single graph button. Right, you press that, and then it puts both of those measures on the same axis. Right, so you see now there's a single axis. And in fact, both of the measures now are plotted on that single axis, but of course the problem here is that the totals, which are dollar amounts, are much larger than the summed quantity purchases, right? You're looking at quantities purchased in the range of hundreds, whereas the totals are in the range of millions, so the quantities don't actually show up. Right, so how do you handle a case like that? Of course, one way to handle it is to just go back to the default view, which has the separate axes, but assuming that that's not what you're looking for, then the way you can handle this kind of situation is by having dual y-axes. You can have one on the left and one on the right. And the way that you do that is you click the Edit Measure button next to the measure that you want to put on the secondary or right side axis. Right, you click that, and there's an option there called Secondary Axis. Just select that, press the Apply button, and then that measure that you've specified to be on the secondary axis will appear on the right side. Right, and so when you have multiple measures, in a situation like this, we only have two, so obviously one will be on the left and one will be on the right. But even in a situation where you had 5 different measures on the chart, you could select which measures should appear on the left axis and which measures should appear on the right axis. Okay, so that's another example of doing these kinds of comparisons between multiple measures on a chart. And again, here's kind of the inverse situation from what we were looking at before. Before we were looking at a single measure and multiple dimensions. Here we're looking at a single dimension, which is just the category, and multiple measures, different ways of looking at comparing multiple measures. So we can switch this, again, we can switch this to a point type chart just to see what other options are available here. And we can go ahead then and we can, in the point type chart, it makes it very easy to look at additional measures as well. So right now, we have quantity purchased, we have total. We could also look, for example, at the average discount by adding that, say, to the color region, or to the size region, or to the shape region. Okay. So perhaps shape might be a better option here. Right, and you can see that when you use the shape region in a point type chart, it basically reflects the amount of the fill in the point. So I'm looking at the discount. I'm using the fill, the degree of fill in the point to represent the discount. I think currently it's probably summing the discounts. It makes more sense to average them, actually. And so that allows me then to compare the discounts, the average discounts for the different groups. You can see that I have a legend up here. All right, and I could even go further, add another measure here. The only other measure that I have actually is this one called paid, which I believe is either 0 or 1, and I might use color to indicate that. So you have all these options available for comparing different measures. Again, this is just a single dimension here, right? Just, again, the category dimension, but we're looking at now 4 different measures. We've got the left side axis. The height of the point on the left side axis gives us the total. The height of a point on the right side axis gives us the quantity purchased. And then we're also looking at the discount, average discount, and this measure called paid. So I'm just trying to give you an indication of how you can do all these different kinds of comparisons using different modalities for presenting information. Okay, let's take a look at something a little bit different, which is actually changing the representation of the measure. Right, so thus far in all the cases we've been looking at essentially the raw measure. Right, we may have been summing the measure, or we may have been averaging the measure, but we're just kind of looking at the raw data. There are other things that you can do to represent the measure on a chart. Right, and what I mean by that is that you can do calculations on the measure. So let's take an example of this. So again, I'm going to go back to a simple chart. Where I just display total versus category. And now what I might choose to do here is I might choose that that I want to display both these raw values, right? So these are the raw totals category by category. And in addition, I'd also like to display the percent of grand total, right? So I'd like to know what percent of the overall total sales for everything is represented by the category of business. So what I can do is I can add the total field again onto the y-axis. Right? Now you'll notice that in this case, because I've got 2 identical fields here, each of these is just the total field, it doesn't give me 2 different axes yet, because again these are identical. But as soon as I make a change to one of these, then it will give me that 2-axis breakout. So what I'll do here is I'm going to use a chart calculation. Actually, I'll do this on the top total field. Right, I'm going to use the calculate option here, and I'll select percent of grand total, meaning that I want to represent this measure as the percent of grand total, right, rather than the raw value. So I'll press apply, right, and then it does break it out into 2 different axes here. On the bottom, I've got my raw data, and on the top, I've got the percent, right? So if I can look at the category of business, it shows me that this is 46% of the overall total. Right? Obviously, the shape, the qualitative shape of these charts is identical, but the values are not, right? So these are percentage values, and these are the raw values. Okay, now you can make this a little bit more interesting by adding in another dimension, such as the product name. Right, so here I've got, on the x-axis, I've got the categories. What if I break out the different products by color? So I'll grab the name field, drag that down to color. Right, so now I've got different colors identifying the different products. Right, but other than that, the chart is the same as it was before. I've got the raw values, now product by product, on the bottom, and I've got the percentage of grand total product by product on the top. But what I might find interesting is perhaps to keep this percent of grand total as it is on the top, but on the bottom, maybe I want to display the individual products as percent of the category. In other words, for this product called XConnect Server, which is this gray group here, I'd like to see what percentage of the category business does that represent. Not what percentage of the overall sales, but what percentage of the business sales. So to do that, I can find that total field here. It's the bottom one. And I can do something a little bit different here. I'll go to the Calculate menu here, and if you don't like any of the presets that are available here, you can select the Custom option at the bottom. Press the Edit button. Right, and what I'd like to do here is I'd like to set the representation for this total field to % of category. Right, calculate % of category. Press OK. Press Apply. Okay. And now you can see that the bottom chart here, the totals for the different products are represented as the percentage of the category that the product belongs to. Right, so here I'm looking at XConnect Server that belongs in the category of business, and this shows me that that particular product represents the sales of that product represent 43% of the sales in the category, right, which happens to be the business category. Okay, so so again, that's just a taste of some other kinds of comparisons that you can do on a chart using chart calculations. And I'm not going to go through the other options there for calculations, but there are a number of them. There's different ways of computing percentages. You can compute changes from the initial group or change from previous group. That's generally useful when you're looking at dates, right? So if you're looking at a breakout by month or something like that, you might want to compare values based on let's say, the previous month. You want to compare the current month to the previous month or the current quarter to the previous quarter. So it's very easy to do just by doing change from previous or % from previous. Let me give you just a very quick example of that, just in case you haven't seen it before, and just show you how easy those kinds of comparisons are. Right, so in this case, I'll just throw a date field on the x-axis, and let's break it out by month. Okay, so these are the raw values, right? The month-to-month sales from 2012 to the end of 2015, right, so what I want to show you here is just that you can easily do a comparison from one month to the next just by switching the calculation method. So again, I'll just go back in here, and from the Calculate menu, just select something like change from previous. That means it's going to give you the absolute change from the previous group, which in this case is the previous month. Right, and then that looks like this. Right, so now what we're looking at in each case is the change, the absolute change from the previous month. Now, in some cases, it may be more useful to look at the % change from the previous month. Right, so I can just switch that to one of the other options here, % from previous. Right, and this gives you then the % change for each month. It shows me the % change from the previous month. In this case, was minus 42%. Right, so a 42% decrease from April to May of 2014. Okay, and again, there are a number of other calculation options that you can play around with to do interesting comparisons on a chart. Okay, well, let's look at then, so basically what we've seen so far is using different dimensions and breaking up the data according to different dimensions to do interesting comparisons between groups within the data. We've looked at putting multiple measures on a chart, right? So either by using multiple axes or a dual axis on the right side, or using the various visual codings, color coding, shape coding, size coding to do comparisons between different measures. And the last thing that I want to look at kind of in this vein is the case where you kind of mix and match dimensions and measures. Right, so let's take a look at just a couple of examples of this. One of them being a kind of a construction that you might call a grid of charts, right? A set of charts in a matrix-like structure, and the other one being the notion of what some people call a bubble chart, where basically you have measures on the x-axis and y-axis, and then you break up the groups using color or some other visual identifier. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these examples. So a simple case of kind of a degenerate case of using a grid of charts would be something like this. All right, so I'm going to have a measure, So there's a measure, again, just using total as the measure. And in this case, I'm going to have 2 dimensions. Right? So let's say something like I'll have a category on the x-axis, and then I'm going to add another dimension to the x-axis as well. I'll add, let's say, the date. And this gives me something like this, right? So it's not really a grid of charts per se, but it's kind of a I guess you call it a group of charts, right? So I have it broken out by date on the bottom x-axis and broken out by category on the top x-axis. That allows me to do comparisons both by category and by year. Right? Now, if I wanted the year on the top and the category on the bottom, I could just reverse the order here. Just drag the date field above the category field. Right? And you can see that it switches the chart type. Again, that's the automatic chart generator is making its best guess at the kind of chart we want. If you wanted to change this to a line chart, you could. But it thinks, it thinks that in this case where you've got the year up here and the categories down here, that looks better as a bar chart. All right, so again, the information that you see here is the same as it was before. It's just you've got here the years up top and the categories below. And again, it allows you to do comparisons category to category and year to year. But let's look at something that's a little bit more involved, and that would be something like where we add another dimension onto the y-axis. Right? So I'm keeping the total measure on the y-axis, but now I'm going to grab the state field. State is basically gives the state corresponding to particular order. So I'm going to grab the state field and drag that onto the y-axis. Okay. And then basically what that does, right, so now that gives me what I would call a grid of charts, or a chart grid. Right? So as before, I've got the year up top, I've got the category on the bottom x-axis, and now on the y-axis, I've got the different states. So each of these cells here represents its own little chart. It represents the data for a particular year and a particular state, right? And broken out by category. Right? Now, charts like this get to be quickly a little bit overwhelming. This is, as you can see, it's a scrolling chart. It's a little bit hard to scroll it in the design view, but with some diligence, you can grab the scroll bar, and you can see that it does scroll up and down. So it's quite a big chart. But the way to kind of attenuate the tedium of doing that is that you just add a selection list, right? So you could just add a selection list for state, right? And set that up however you want. And then that allows you to limit the number of states that you're going to see in that chart. So I could select just a few states, and now it's a bit more reasonable to look at. And of course, I could do the same thing for the category as well. I could add a selection list for category if I want to try to control the complexity of the chart a little bit either by letting the user make those selections, or of course, if I knew exactly the chart that I wanted the user to see, and I just wanted it to always be that way, I could add these selection components and then just hide them like I showed you before, and then the user will just see the chart exactly as the designer has made it. But in a way, that's a little bit against the spirit of dashboard design, because generally, if you're doing something like this, you probably do want the user to be able to choose what they want to see. That's it's kind of the point of making a dashboard. Otherwise, you might as well just send them a picture or something. The whole idea is that the user can slice and dice the data, so probably you would want to leave these controls visible. Okay, so that's the concept of a grid of charts, and again, it's achieved just by putting a dimension, one or more dimensions on the x-axis and one or more dimensions on the y-axis, and then of course also having a measure somewhere. Right, so somewhere in this equation, you've got to have a measure. Otherwise, you're not going to be displaying anything very interesting. So you're going to, have at least a dimension somewhere, a measure somewhere on the x-axis or on the y-axis. Okay, well, let's take a look at another variation, which is a case where we've got two measures on both the, or I should say one measure on both the x-axis and the y-axis. And this is a construction that's often useful for constructing these kinds of bubble bubble charts, as people sometimes call them. So let's delete all that, and let's just take a look at this construction. Okay, and as an example of this, what I'll do is I'll put the total on one axis, so total on the x-axis, and quantity purchased on the y-axis. Okay. And I want these, I want to make sure that these are both sum. Okay, and then I'm going to use some of these visual bindings to break out the data in different ways, right? So I've got the two measures, right? But I want to discriminate the data. Right now there's just a single data point because I haven't defined any groups, right? So I want to introduce some dimensions here, and I could do something like this. I can use a color to distinguish the two regions by grabbing the region field, dragging it down to color. Okay, so now you can see that I've got a blue point over here. This represents the east region, right? And if you hover right, you can see that the height gives me the summed quantity purchased for that region, and the distance from the left axis gives me the total for that region, right? And I've also got this green point that gives me the other region, the west region. And then I can go further. I can use for example, the size of the point to represent the average discount, right? So I can grab the discount here and drag that down to size, right? And I probably want to set that to average. Whoops. I want that to represent the average discount. Okay, so now really I've got three measures going on here. I've got the quantity purchased over here on the y-axis, I've got the total on the x-axis, and I'm using the size of the point to represent the average discount. And I can introduce additional dimensions as well. Let's say that I want to keep the region, I want to keep the color as representative of the region, but I actually want to see the different states as well. Right? So I don't want to introduce new colors, and let's say that I don't want to introduce different shapes, but I do want to break out the data by state. So again, here's a case where I could use the break by option here. So let's take a look at what that would look like. I'll find the state field, drag it down to break by, and again, remember that the break by option is a way to break out the different groups without introducing additional visual formatting. So you can see that the blue color still represents the region. There's only two colors. There's one for the east and there's one for the west, but it does break out the different points according to state. So if I look at this point, this is New Jersey, right? So this point on the chart represents New Jersey, this point on the chart represents New York, and so on, right? Now, how do I know that? I know that from the tooltip, right? The tooltip tells me which point is which point. If I actually wanted to label them, right, so so that it would be clear to somebody looking at the chart without using a tooltip which state is which state, well, there are two ways that I could do that. First of all, I could use a visual format. In other words, I could, for example, use the shape of the point, and then I would have different shape corresponding to each state. But if I wanted to keep the visuals like this without introducing different shapes, I can use the text area down at the bottom. So I can grab the state field from here, drag it down to the text binding at the bottom, and that will just put the state names on the states. So now without using the tooltip, I can look at these different points, and I can see what state I'm looking at. Okay, so that basically kind of brings us to the end of the basic use of the chart editor to do comparisons with different dimensions and different measures, and simultaneously with different dimensions and measures. If as I went through all that, if anybody was jotting down any questions, just maybe save them till I'm done. I have a couple more things to go through that go a little bit further than what we've done so far. But if you do have questions, jot them down, and I'll be happy to take them towards the end. Now, there is one other major topic that I wanted to talk about is doing date comparisons, because that's something that people often want to do to compare two different years, or to compare this year versus last year, this quarter versus last quarter, that type of thing. So I'll look at that in a moment, but before I do that, I just want to take a look at some other built-in tools that are helpful for doing comparisons on a chart. So let's see. First of all, there is filtering, right? So filtering is helpful for doing comparisons because it limits the data that you see. Now, obviously, one way to filter is to use a selection component. So, for example, you could have a selection for, let's say, for total, right? If you drag that in, you get a range slider, right? And that would allow a user to restrict, right? Restrict the values of total that are going to be displayed on the chart, right? Look at particular ranges of total, or or similarly particular ranges of quantity, or particular discounts, and so on and so forth, right? So that allows the user to kind of focus in on just the area that they want to do the comparison for. Right, so that is one helpful aid for doing comparisons. Another type of filtering is available through the use of a selection container. Right, so if I add a selection container to the dashboard, selection container is just one of the components that's available in the selection folder here, then what that gives me is it gives me a right-click filter option. Right, so I can right-click on the chart, select filter, right, and that kind of gives me a built-in filter that, again, allows me to make various filtering operations for the chart, right? And when I'm happy with my filtering, I can click away, and the filter that I've applied is displayed in the selection container. So again, this is a way using filtering that the user can kind of narrow down the comparisons that they want to make. If they're presented with an overwhelming chart that has tons and tons of data, a lot of dimensions, a lot of measures, very difficult to process all at once, then you as the designer can give the user some help by either providing a selection container so that they can use the right-click filter option, or by providing selection elements that allow them to narrow down the data that they're seeing. Okay, now there are other options beyond that. Let me just see, is that filter still in place? Okay, no, that filter's gone. Okay, so other options that are available to help in doing these kinds of comparisons on a chart are the zooming and brushing tools. So the brushing tool is that if you select a point on a chart, you'll notice that in the mini toolbar at the top there's a brush. And basically what that allows you to do is to select a point or a group of points, right, and brush those points. And what is immediately apparent is that those points have turned red, but what's not apparent is that if I had other charts here, those points would turn red in those charts as well. So let's just see if we can make this play out here. All right, so let's say I had another chart down here. Let's say one that was broken by year or something like that. So we've got date and total. Right, so something just simple like this. Right, what I could do is I can select a group, brush that group, and then that group will be broken out on that other chart as well. So again, this is an aid for doing comparisons. It allows me to select data in one chart and then do comparisons for that data within some other chart that has the data already broken out using some other angle, some other view. Okay, so that's the concept of brushing. Zooming is just what it sounds like, right? Zooming, you've got a chart and you want to, let's say you want to do a finer comparison of the data. Let me take off the brushing. The data that we have in this area, let's say you want to, this is of particular interest to you, but it's a little bit difficult to discriminate those different points. So what you can do is you can select those points, press the zoom button in the mini toolbar, right? And that's going to zoom in on those points, and now it becomes much easier to do the comparison, right? You can see what the value for Pennsylvania is, gives you a much clearer view what the value for Illinois is, and so on. Okay, then there is a couple more things that I want to show before I get on to talking about dates, just in the way of these kind of built-in tools that help do comparisons. Another tool is the concept of highlighting. Right, so the concept of highlighting is that you specify some condition that basically colors data on the chart if it meets that condition. Right? So I assume we've looked at this in a previous webinar, but since it is apropos, I'll just mention again how to do that. What you do is you click on the data and you select the highlight option, and then you create a highlight, and I guess we could say something like We'll call it high discount. And we'll make it pink. And the condition will be something like the average discount is, let's say, greater than 2%, 0.02. Okay, so average discount is greater than 2%. For all those points on the chart where that's true, I want to color those in this purple or pink color. So press OK. Okay, and there you go. Right, so that's another way of doing these kinds of comparisons by using highlights to bring to the user's attention points of interest on the chart. Now, of course, you could make that modifiable by the user as well. Right, so if you wanted the user to be able to highlight different, let's say, different ranges of the discount, so they might want to look at discounts below 10%, discounts above 3%, right? So if you wanted to give the user that control, what you could do is just use an input component, something like a slider. Right, so this is a slider control. Set the limits appropriately, so maybe 0, maybe maximum should be 5%. 0.005 increment, right, and apply a percent format. Right, so here's a slider, and then basically what I want to do is I want to use this slider to control the highlight condition. And that's easy enough. Just right-click, go back into that highlight definition that we were in a moment ago, edit the condition, and instead of having this fixed condition that says the average discount is greater than 2%, I'll just choose to have that percentage supplied by the slider. Right, slider 1, that's the name of that slider. So now the highlight condition is going to be determined by the value of that slider. Right, so I'll modify that condition. Right, and now basically the user can select, do they want to see all the points that have greater than 3% average discount or greater than 1%, right? So now I'm looking at all those guys. So again, this is just a tool that you can provide the user using a highlight to help them compare data in interesting ways. And finally, and very quickly, before we get to comparing dates, I just want to show you also the concept of a target line. All right, so let me remove that. Oh, first let me undo the highlight. The final aid to comparison that I want to show you is a target line, which basically allows you to draw lines at different places on the chart. Obviously not random places, but interesting places like quartiles or percentiles or the mean, the median, average, confidence intervals. So all these different kinds of places that you might want to put designations on the chart to help the user make comparisons. So again, the way you do this is you right-click, go to Properties for the chart, and under the Advanced tab, there's the target line area. And I'll show you that just the simplest, one of the simplest ones. You can choose to put just a line on the chart, for example, at the mean or the median or the max or something like that. In this case, a band is just a pair of lines that, so basically you specify an upper line, a lower line, and you can set colors in between and below and above. I'll just choose one of the simple statistical target lines, which is, I'll just choose the quartiles. Okay. So it's just, it basically puts a line at I think at 25%, at 50%, and at 75%, something like that. You can set the fill colors, you can set a fill above and below. I'm not worrying too much about the settings here because I just want to illustrate. And then basically what you get is a set of lines on the chart that designate important levels on the chart. In this case, important levels of quantity purchased, the 25th percentile, the 50th percentile, and the 75th percentile. Okay, so that brings me to the end of kind of the tools section here. These are basically, I just illustrated a set of tools, including the built-in tools that you have up here in the mini toolbar, brushing, zooming. I looked at a couple of the other ones, highlighting, target lines. And these are all basically tools that you have in your tool chest when you're thinking of how to help the user make meaningful comparisons on a chart. Okay, so finally, in the last few minutes here, I'm not going to go too deep into this, but I just want to get to the topic of doing date comparisons. Right? Something that people commonly do. So let me add a new chart. Now, the basic kind of date comparison that you might want to do is well, of course, something like this. You just put the date field on the x-axis, and you have a measure like this, right? So here you're doing a comparison according to dates. You're comparing different years. Of course, you could switch the level of the date grouping to something else, like quarter, and then you're comparing different quarters. So that's the most basic kind of date comparisons, but obviously I want to go a little bit beyond that. So let's say that you have something like a category on the x-axis. Right. So if you wanted to do a date comparison here, right, in this context, if you wanted to break things out by date, again, you can grab the date field, you can drag it down to, say, the color region, right? Now you're, I still have it broken out by quarter, but basically now I'm comparing different quarters here. And if I wanted to limit the the dates that I'm comparing, again, I could drag in a date field. I would get a range slider, and I can use this range slider to select some range of dates that I want to compare. Right. So now I'm just comparing a selected range of quarters, and of course I can shift that selection along as I choose. Okay, so that's, I'd say, that's kind of the most basic way of doing date comparisons, either by putting a date field on the x-axis or by putting a date field on the, into the visual bindings, color, shape, size, or text. Okay, but the disadvantage of this is that you're a little bit constrained as to the types of comparisons that you can make. Obviously, if you're working with a range slider like this, you can only select a contiguous range, right? So you can't compare, let's say, a few weeks from 2012 against a few weeks from 2015. There's no way to do that kind of discontiguous selection. So if you're looking at something more advanced, some kind of more advanced comparison of dates, what you might consider doing is, instead of doing this, you might consider using a calendar, right? So let's just take a quick look at calendars. I'm going to remove this. And okay, so this is the chart is now back the way that it started, just total versus category. And what I'd like to do is some kind of more advanced date comparison. So I'm going to grab a calendar control, which is over here. Okay, and a calendar is useful both for making basic selections, right? So if I just wanted to filter this chart, so that, let's say I just saw a few weeks from 2012 or a few weeks from 2015, I could do that using the chart. But what I want to show you is how you can use the calendar. But what I want to show you is how you can do comparisons using the calendar as well. So what I'll do is, first of all, I'll bind the calendar to the date field. Okay, so now this calendar is going to be filtering the dates. Then I'm going to make a couple of changes to the calendar. I'm going to press the Switch to Year View button so that I can select by month. Press the Switch to Range/Comparison button, gives me side by side. And then finally press the Switch to Comparison Mode button in the mini toolbar, and that allows me to compare different dates using the calendar. So for example, I can go back over here to 2013 and select February of 2013. On this side, select, let's say, February of 2015. Right? So that's a kind of an interesting comparison. I might want to see how we did sales-wise in February of those 2 years, and then press the Apply button, and that will automatically give me a breakout. It breaks the chart, obviously, into two pieces and allows me to compare 2015 to 2013 February in both cases. Right, so that's a way to do more advanced comparisons of dates. In other words, when you want to compare discontiguous ranges of dates, you can use a calendar for that purpose. Now, just to wrap up, I'm not going to go into any more detail on the calendar. Obviously, this you can do more than just compare 2 months. You can compare days or weeks, groups of months, and so on. But I just want to mention a limitation of this, which is that basically it produces this kind of chart. In other words, whenever you use a calendar to force a comparison into a chart, you're always going to end up with 2 different y-axis regions, and you can't make these into a single chart, right? You can't you can't move this part down onto that part so that they're on the same axis. This is basically what you get. Additionally, sometimes you might like to do comparisons that are date comparisons that move in time. In other words, a kind of a running comparison. And an example of that would be comparing last quarter to this quarter or last year to this year. Obviously, those terms, last year and this year, are dependent on what moment of time you are currently in, right? So right now, this year is 2015, last year is 2014, but next year, if we were to look at the dashboard, that would be different, right? Then it would be, this year would be 2016, and last year would be 2015. So how can you set up a comparison like that, where the comparison is relative to the current moment in time? So I'm going to wrap up just with that. The way that we're going to do that kind of thing, I'm going to get rid of this. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce a new dimension. Right, so currently in our data source here, in our data block, we've got a set of dimensions, category, city, company, date, and so on. What I want to do is I want to introduce a new dimension that I'm going to call period that's going to designate the particular data as either from this year or from last year. Okay? And I'll do that using a calculated field. Right, so I'm going to right-click on the data block, select New Calculated Field. And this is going to be, you can select either detail or aggregate for a calculated field. In this case, it'll be detail. In other words, the calculation that I'm going to do to determine whether a sale is from this year or last year is going to be based on the actual detail data in the data source here. And I'll call the name of this new column, this new dimension, I'll call it period. Okay, I'm going to write this as a JavaScript, so I'll switch this to script. And then the first thing I'm going to do is just define a couple of easy variables. The first one will be, I'll just call the variable this year, and I just want it to have the year, just the number of the current year, which I can get by peeling off the year part of today's date. Right? I'm doing this quickly because my point here is not to teach you everything about JavaScript, but just to give you an idea of, some of the things that you could do to do these kinds of date comparisons. Right, so I've defined a variable that basically calc.today just gives me today's date as a date object. Year strips off the year, so this variable will just contain the number 2015. Right, and I could also, if I want to be verbose about this, I could define another one. What did I write? Year. Last year. Right, last year is just this year minus 1. Okay, so I've got this year and I've got last year, and then I'm just going to do the following test. I'll say if, and here I'm going to go to the fields list, and I've got my date field. So if the value in the date field, in particular, if the year part of the value in the date field is equal to this year, right, that's the value that I computed up here. Right, so if the year of the date in the date field is equal to this year, then in this new dimension that I've made called period, I want that to have the string, the value this year. And then I'll say else if the year part of this date field is equal to last year, right, again, I calculated last year up here. That's, in this case, it's going to be 2014. So if the year part of the date field is 2014, in this case, then I want that to return last year as the value in this period dimension. And then, of course, I could go on. I could, if I wanted to identify, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, I could do all that. But at this point, I'll just say else. Right? In other words, if it's not, if the year in the of the order date is not either this year or last year, then I just want to return the value other year. Okay, so this is not a very complicated script. Again, all I'm doing is this script is looking into the values in the date field that I have, and it's creating a new column called period, and the values in this new column called period will be either this year, last year, or other year, depending on the value in the date column. Okay, so that's what I'm creating here. Press OK. Okay, so there is my new dimension. Right, so there it is. I created that. And then what I can do is I can use that dimension, right, just like I would use any other dimension. All right, so I can open up the chart editor, and I can use that period dimension to discriminate these different groups by using color, for example. Okay. And you can see that now here, again, on the bottom x-axis, I've got the categories, but now the data is broken out as this year, other year, or last year, right? Those are the groupings that I made in my, using my calculated script. Right? And if I only wanted to compare this year and last year, then what I would do is I would just make a selection list here again, which I could either expose to the user or not, depending on how much control I want to give the user. But if I just wanted this chart to compare last year and this year, I would just select those two options, right? And then if I want to, hide that selection list. And this gives me a lot more flexibility as to how I represent that comparison, right? You can see that these are being represented on the same axis. If I wanted to, I could represent them side by side. Right? I could represent them using different colors, different shapes, different sizes, all the things that you could do using the visual panel, the visual controls down here, right? So this gives me a lot more flexibility that I don't have when I use the calendar widget to do the comparison. And the other advantage it gives me is that because of the way that I wrote the script, this year and last year will reference the correct years regardless of when somebody accesses this dashboard, right? So if somebody comes back 2 years from now and loads up this dashboard, then last year and this year will refer to the correct years from the standpoint of that person who's using it in the future. Right? Whereas if I had done a similar comparison using a calendar, right, that would be a fixed comparison. If I compare 2014 to 2013, then even if somebody loads that up 2 years from now, it's still going to be comparing 2014 to 2013. So, this is the basically what I wanted to show you. One other common thing that you might do in this case, rather than having something like category down here, is you might want to have something like month of year, right? So if you wanted to compare last year and this year broken out by month of year, you can just go ahead and add the date field instead of the category there. Add the date field, switch the representation to, let's say, month of year. And then probably want to switch that back to stack. All right, and this allows me then to compare for each month of the year. You can see that I've got the 12 months of the year here. I can compare last year's sales versus this year's sales. Okay, well, I'm going to stop there because I went 1 minute over the hour mark, which is longer than I usually do. So I'm going to stop there, and hopefully what I've done is I've just given you a bit of a taste of doing comparisons, different dimensions, different measures, doing date comparisons, either using a calendar, the calendar widget, or using some more advanced scripting techniques to get a dimension that has the date breakdown that you're looking for. Okay, so if there's any questions, I'm going to watch the box here. For those who need to sign off, thanks for listening, and hope you'll come back next time and have a nice weekend, most of all. But for anyone who wants to ask a question, go ahead, type away.